Judge William Harrison's courtroom maintained its usual frigid temperature, but the tension made it feel even colder that Tuesday morning. The seasoned judge sat elevated behind his bench, his silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting as he reviewed the day's docket. After 15 years on the bench, he had developed a reputation for running his courtroom with military precision and unwavering adherence to protocol. The morning proceeded with its typical efficiency until Sarah Thompson's case was called. She entered with quiet confidence, her charcoal gray business suit and pearl necklace suggesting someone who understood professional decorum. At 35, Sarah had already established herself as a respected figure in the local business community, though Judge Harrison knew none of this as he glanced down at the citation before him. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had become his trademark, "you're here for 3 parking violations within the past month, all in restricted zones, all during peak hours." He peered over his glasses, noting her composed demeanor, unusual for someone facing multiple violations. Sarah stepped forward, her portfolio clutched firmly in her hands. "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances," she began, her voice clear and measured. But Judge Harrison had heard every excuse imaginable during his tenure, and his patience for explanations had worn thin years ago. "Miss Thompson," he interrupted, raising his hand in a dismissive gesture that had silenced countless defendants before her. "The photographic evidence clearly shows your vehicle in clearly marked restricted zones. The signage is explicit, and this is your 3rd offense." The gallery watched in tense silence as Sarah attempted once more to speak. "Your Honor, these incidents occurred while I was." "That will be enough," Judge Harrison cut in, his tone sharp enough to draw a slight flinch from his clerk. "The purpose of these restrictions is to maintain order in our city. Multiple violations suggest a pattern of disregard for that order." He shuffled the papers before him, already mentally moving on to the next case. Sarah stood her ground, her dignity intact despite the judge's dismissive treatment. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the subtle worry lines around her eyes, the only visible sign of her frustration. The courtroom remained silent, save for the soft whirring of the overhead fans and the occasional shuffle of papers. $300 per violation, Miss Thompson. $900 total, Judge Harrison declared, reaching for his gavel. Payable within 30 days. The gavel struck with practiced precision, its sharp crack echoing through the hushed courtroom. As Sarah gathered her belongings, she maintained her composure, though her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked her portfolio under her arm. The court officer stepped forward, ready to escort her out, but she needed no guidance. Her heels clicked purposefully against the polished floor as she made her way to the exit. Judge Harrison had already turned his attention to the next case, missing the meaningful glances exchanged between the court staff. His longtime clerk, Mrs. Reynolds, pressed her lips into a thin line as she organized the next set of documents, her 30 years of experience telling her that something about this case felt different. The morning sun continued its slow arc across the courtroom's wooden panels, unaware that this seemingly routine interaction would soon catalyze a profound change in the lives of both the stern judge and the dignified woman he had so quickly dismissed. The Grand Meridian Hotel's crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the marble foyer as Judge William Harrison arrived for the annual Municipal Leadership Gala. His bow tie felt uncomfortably tight, a physical reminder of his reluctance to attend these mandatory social functions. He much preferred the structured environment of his courtroom to the unpredictable nature of social gatherings. As he handed his overcoat to the attendant, Harrison caught his reflection in one of the ornate mirrors lining the entrance hall. At 62, his distinguished appearance, silver hair perfectly coiffed, black tuxedo impeccably tailored, projected the authority he cultivated over his years on the bench. Yet tonight, something felt oddly unsettled in his usual self-assurance. The ballroom doors opened to reveal a sea of Boston's elite mingling among elaborate floral arrangements and ice sculptures. Harrison made his perfunctory rounds, exchanging pleasantries with fellow judges and city officials, his responses automated after years of practice. He was calculating how much longer he needed to stay when the feedback from the microphone cut through the ambient chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." Harrison turned toward the stage, and his carefully maintained composure cracked. There, standing at the podium in a stunning royal blue evening gown, was Sarah Thompson, the same woman he had found that morning. The crystal pendant at her neck caught the spotlight, but it was her presence that truly commanded attention. "Thank you all for supporting the Children's Literacy Foundation tonight," Sarah began, her voice carrying the same dignity it had in his courtroom, but now paired with an authority that made several city council members lean forward in their seats. "For the past decade, we've worked to ensure that every child in our city has access to books, tutoring, and the opportunity to dream beyond their circumstances." Harrison found himself rooted to the spot as Sarah detailed the foundation's achievements. 20 new reading centers in underserved neighborhoods, summer programs that had helped thousands of children maintain their reading levels, and partnerships with local businesses to provide internships for high school students. The ballroom erupted in applause as she shared their latest initiative, a mobile library program that would reach children in domestic violence shelters. During her speech, Harrison observed how the city's most influential citizens responded to her. The mayor nodded enthusiastically from his table, while the chief of police wiped away what appeared to be tears. Even Justice Martins of the state's Supreme Court was taking notes. "And none of this would be possible," Sarah continued, "without our dedicated volunteers who brave all kinds of weather, navigate difficult parking situations, and sometimes even accept personal inconvenience to ensure our children receive the support they need." The pointed reference wasn't lost on Harrison, who felt heat rise in his collar. He watched as Sarah graciously acknowledged various donors and community partners, her genuine warmth a stark contrast to the defendant he'd dismissed so readily that morning. As she concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Harrison made his way to the bar, ordering a Scotch neat with slightly trembling hands. Behind him, he could hear snippets of conversation. Sarah's work with the literacy program, Transform the East Side Community, dedicates every Tuesday morning to delivering books. The last comment made him pause mid-sip. Tuesday mornings, the same morning he'd seen her in court, the same morning he'd refused to let her explain. The Scotch suddenly tasted bitter in his mouth as the weight of his earlier judgment began to settle uncomfortably on his shoulders. The evening progressed into the dinner service, with Judge Harrison finding himself seated at table 7, strategically positioned to overhear conversations from the adjacent table 6, where Sarah Thompson's colleagues were engaged in animated discussion. He maintained a veneer of interest in his table's conversation about golf membership rates, while his attention remained fixed on the revelations unfolding nearby. Sarah's been absolutely tireless since Angela's passing, a woman in a silver sequin gown remarked, her voice carrying just enough for Harrison to catch the words. 5 years, and she's transformed that tragedy into something remarkable. Harrison's fork paused halfway to his mouth as another voice joined the conversation. The domestic violence shelters were Angela's passion project, weren't they? Sarah's made it her mission to continue that work. The judge set down his utensils entirely, his appetite deserting him as the context of Sarah's morning violations began to take shape. His precisely arranged filet mignon remained untouched as he pieced together the fragments of Sarah Thompson's story, a story he had refused to hear in his courtroom. Did you know she's been handling all the supply deliveries herself since Marcus left the foundation? This came from a distinguished gentleman Harrison recognized as the city's former district attorney. Every Tuesday morning, rain or shine. Books, emergency supplies, children's clothing, whatever the shelters need. The implication struck Harrison with the force of a physical blow. Tuesday mornings, the same morning he had imposed those fines, the same morning he had silenced her attempts to explain. It's not just the shelters, another voice added. Sarah's been coordinating care for her mother since the stroke last month, running between the foundation, the shelters, And the nursing home. I don't know how she manages it all. Harrison reached for his water glass, his throat suddenly dry. He recalled Sarah's composed demeanor in his courtroom, the dignity with which she had accepted his harsh judgment. How many other stories had he dismissed over the years? How many other lives had he impacted without taking a moment to understand the circumstances? Remember last week's emergency at the Pine Street shelter? The conversation continued, oblivious to Harrison's growing discomfort. Sarah got the call at midnight about their heating system failing. She was there within 20 minutes with space heaters from her own home. Spent the whole night making sure none of the families would have to relocate in the cold. The weight of these revelations pressed against Harrison's chest like a physical burden. He thought of his own daughter, safe and secure, in her Manhattan apartment, while Sarah Thompson worked tirelessly to protect vulnerable women and children across the city. The contrast between his assumptions and reality left a bitter taste that no amount of fine wine could wash away. As the dessert service began, Harrison observed Sarah moving from table to table, graciously thanking donors and volunteers. Despite the demanding day she'd had, a day he had made significantly more difficult, she exhibited genuine warmth and enthusiasm for each person she encountered. The $900 he had so cavalierly imposed as a fine now seemed like a cruel punishment for someone whose only crime was choosing to prioritize others' emergencies over parking regulations. The evening's carefully prepared creme brulee arrived at his table, its caramelized surface gleaming under the chandelier light. Harrison couldn't bring himself to touch it, his appetite destroyed by the growing realization of his role in potentially hampering the vital community services Sarah provided. The Grand Meridian Hotel's marble bathroom provided Judge Harrison no escape from the mounting weight of his realizations. He stood before the ornate mirror, his reflection offering an unforgiving assessment of the man he had become. With deliberate movements, he loosened his bow tie, the simple act somehow symbolic of the unraveling of his carefully constructed worldview. The bathroom's soft lighting and elegant fixtures seemed to mock the harsh fluorescent glare of his courtroom, where he had passed judgment on Sarah Thompson mere hours ago. He splashed cold water on his face, watching droplets fall into the pristine basin, each one carrying a memory of similar cases he had dismissed without consideration. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter, Catherine, in Manhattan. "Hope the gala's not too boring, Dad. Just closed another major account." The message, accompanied by a photo of her celebration dinner at an exclusive restaurant, triggered a cascade of uncomfortable comparisons in Harrison's mind. While Catherine had attended the finest private schools, children in his own city struggled with basic literacy, the very issue Sarah Thompson worked tirelessly to address. His daughter's privilege, carefully cultivated through his own success, stood in stark contrast to the struggles of those who appeared before his bench daily. Harrison recalled his early days as a law student, full of idealistic fervor about justice and equality. He had sworn to be different from the prejudiced judges he had encountered during his clerkships. Yet here he stood, 3 decades later, having become precisely what he had once despised. Someone who saw stereotypes instead of stories, someone who wielded authority without wisdom. The memory of this morning's courtroom session played relentlessly in his mind. He analyzed his own behavior with the same scrutiny he applied to evidence in his cases. His dismissive wave, the harsh tone, the refusal to listen, all pointed to assumptions he had made based on nothing more than superficial observations. A distinguished older gentleman entered the bathroom, nodding in recognition. "Quite something about Sarah Thompson's work, isn't it, Bill? Heard she's expanded the literacy program to reach over 5,000 children this year alone." The casual comment landed like an indictment. "Indeed," Harrison managed to respond, his judicial poker face maintaining composure while his internal turmoil intensified. After the man left, Harrison found himself conducting a silent cross-examination of his own conscience. How many other Sarah Thompsons had stood before him? How many vital community services had his hasty judgments impacted? The questions multiplied like evidence in a complex case, each one demanding attention, each one requiring careful consideration. He thought of his late wife, Elizabeth, who had always urged him to look deeper, to remember that every person who entered his courtroom carried a story worth hearing. The law without compassion, she used to say, is just sophisticated cruelty. Her words, dismissed as idealistic during their marriage, now resonated with devastating clarity. Harrison straightened his bow tie, the practiced motion feeling foreign to his trembling fingers. His reflection showed every one of his 62 years, the lines in his face deeper than they had seemed this morning. The distinguished judge who had entered this bathroom minutes ago was now faced with an unavoidable truth. His swift justice had often been neither swift nor just. The sounds of the gala filtered through the bathroom door. Laughter, clinking glasses, the distant murmur of meaningful work being celebrated. Sarah Thompson was out there, continuing her vital community service despite his best efforts to penalize it. The realization demanded action. But first, it demanded something he had not done in years. It demanded that he listen. Sarah Thompson stood at the coat check counter, her evening of networking drawing to a close. The attendant had just retrieved her navy wool coat when a familiar voice cut through the marble-floored lobby. "Miss Thompson." Judge Harrison's tone carried none of its earlier courtroom authority, replaced instead by something she had never expected to hear from him: humility. She turned, one arm halfway into her coat sleeve, to find the judge standing several feet away. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, though his posture remained impeccable. "I believe I owe you more than just an apology," he said, his voice lowered to ensure their conversation remained private. The lobby had nearly emptied, leaving them in a quiet space punctuated only by the distant sounds of the cleaning staff preparing for tomorrow's events. Sarah studied the judge's face, noting the subtle signs of internal struggle beneath his composed exterior. "Your Honor," she began, but he raised his hand, not in dismissal this time, but in gentle request. "Please," he said, "tonight. I'm just William Harrison, a man who needs to acknowledge his mistakes." He gestured toward a cluster of elegant armchairs arranged near a softly burbling fountain. "Would you permit me a few minutes of your time?" "I promise to listen this time." Sarah considered the request, then nodded, draped her coat over her arm, and followed him to the seating area. The fountain's gentle sounds provided a soothing backdrop as they settled into their chairs, the evening's formal dynamics shifting into something more genuine. "I heard about your sister, Angela," Harrison began carefully, watching Sarah's expression, "and about your work with the domestic violence shelters. I should have given you the opportunity to explain this morning." Sarah's fingers unconsciously touched the crystal pendant at her neck. A gift from Angela, he learned later. "The parking restrictions do create challenges for our delivery schedule," she acknowledged. "We've been trying to coordinate with the city for designated loading zones, but the process is complicated." Their conversation deepened, moving from the immediate issue of parking violations to broader discussions about community needs. Harrison found himself taking mental notes as Sarah outlined the cascading effects of seemingly minor legal obstacles on charitable work. Her insights about the intersection of municipal regulations and community service opened his eyes to blind spots in the justice system he had never considered. "The trouble is," Sarah explained, leaning forward slightly, "when we have to choose between following a parking regulation and getting emergency supplies to a family in crisis, we'll choose the family every time. We accept the fines as a cost of doing business, but it strains our limited resources." Harrison felt each word like a gentle reprimand to his earlier harshness. "What if we could find a better way?" he proposed, surprising himself with the suggestion. "A system that maintains order while accommodating essential community services." Their discussion expanded, touching on potential solutions: special permits for recognized charities, designated loading times, a community service offset program for certain violations. As they talked, the traditional barriers between judge and defendant, between authority and supplicant, dissolved into a partnership of shared purpose. The hotel staff had begun dimming the lobby lights when they finally noticed the time. 3 hours had passed, marked only by the depth of their conversation and the growing list of possibilities they had explored. Sarah gathered her coat and Harrison rose, offering his card with a substantially different demeanor than he had shown that morning. "This conversation isn't over, Ms. Thompson," he said firmly. "I believe we've only just begun to address the real issues at hand." The following Tuesday morning, Judge William Harrison's courtroom felt markedly different. The temperature remained constant, the fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. As he reviewed the day's docket, his fingers lingered on each case file, considering the untold stories that might lie beneath the stark legal language. His first case involved a middle-aged woman, Margaret Chen, charged with multiple parking violations near the senior center. In the past, Harrison would have processed this case with mechanical efficiency. Today, however, he removed his reading glasses and leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Chen," he began, his tone measured and attentive. "Before we proceed, would you tell me about the circumstances surrounding these violations?" The court clerk, Mrs. Reynolds, glanced up from her paperwork, startled by this departure from routine. Margaret Chen, initially tense with anticipation of the usual swift judgment, straightened her shoulders. "Your Honor, I volunteer with the Meals on Wheels program. We've been short-staffed, and the designated parking spots are often blocked by construction vehicles. I have to choose between missing my delivery schedule for homebound seniors or risking a ticket." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then reached for his phone instead of his gavel. Under the puzzled gazes of the court staff, he typed a brief message to Sarah Thompson. "Similar situation to yours. Need your insight on potential solutions." Sarah's response arrived moments later, suggesting a collaborative approach between the senior center and the city's transportation department. Harrison turned his attention back to Ms. Chen, who stood waiting for her sentence. "The court recognizes the essential nature of your service," he declared. "Instead of imposing fines, I'm ordering a 30-day suspension of penalties while we implement a solution." He proceeded to outline a plan involving temporary permits and coordinated delivery schedules. The whispers that rippled through the courtroom grew louder as the morning progressed. Case after case revealed similar stories of community service complicated by rigid regulations. A teacher transporting supplies to underfunded schools, a volunteer delivering pet food to elderly pet owners. Each narrative added another piece to the mosaic of community needs that Harrison had previously overlooked. During the lunch recess, Harrison convened an impromptu meeting with Sarah Thompson and representatives from various community organizations. They gathered in his chambers, where his imposing desk, once a symbol of authority, became a roundtable for collaborative problem-solving. "We need a systematic approach," Sarah suggested, spreading out a map of the city's service areas. "Something that acknowledges the reality of community work while maintaining necessary order." Harrison watched as she outlined potential solutions, her practical experience illuminating blind spots in the legal framework. By afternoon session, Harrison had implemented a preliminary program. Cases involving verified community service workers would be reviewed under modified guidelines. His clerk received instructions to coordinate with nonprofit organizations for documentation and scheduling arrangements. The day's final case involved a young man who had accumulated parking tickets while delivering donations to a local food bank. Instead of reaching for his gavel, Harrison reached for his phone again, this time connecting the defendant with Sarah's Foundation for Mentorship Opportunities. As the courtroom emptied that evening, Mrs. Reynolds approached his bench. "Quite a different day, Your Honor," she observed, organizing the files of transformed cases. Harrison nodded, noticing how his gavel had remained untouched since morning, gathering a thin layer of dust that somehow seemed appropriate. "Different indeed, Mrs. Reynolds," he replied, examining his reflection in the darkened courtroom windows. "I believe we're finally dispensing justice rather than just sentences." Word of Judge Harrison's transformed courtroom spread through Boston's legal community with remarkable speed. The Boston Globe's justice correspondent, Alina Martinez, sat in the gallery one morning, her notebook filling with observations about the unprecedented changes taking place in courtroom 304. Her subsequent article, titled "Justice Reimagined: How One Court's Revolution is Changing Lives," caught the attention of the state Supreme Court. The statistics were compelling. A 60% reduction in repeat offenses, a 75% increase in community service participation, and an unprecedented level of cooperation between the justice system and local nonprofits. Chief Justice Margaret Chen, intrigued by the data, scheduled an official observation. She arrived unannounced one Thursday morning, watching as Harrison handled a case involving a food bank volunteer. Instead of imposing fines, he facilitated a partnership between the volunteer and Sarah Thompson's foundation, turning a potential punishment into an opportunity for expanded community service. In my 30 years on the bench, Chief Justice Chen later remarked during a judicial conference, "I've never seen such an elegant solution to the conflict between legal structure and community needs." Her endorsement prompted inquiries from courts across the state, each seeking to implement what was now being called the Harrison-Thompson model. The transformation manifested in unexpected ways. Local businesses, inspired by the court's example, began offering designated parking spaces for verified community service workers. The City Council, led by Councilwoman Rebecca Martinez, passed ordinances creating special permits for charitable organizations. What had begun as one judge's change of heart was reshaping the entire city's approach to community service. Sarah's foundation experienced its own revolution. The reduced financial burden of parking fines allowed for expansion of services. A teenage volunteer, James Carter, who had once faced penalties for parking violations while delivering books, now managed their new youth literacy program. His story, featured in the local news, became a powerful testament to the impact of second chances. The data continued to tell a compelling story. Crime rates in areas served by community organizations dropped by 30%. Volunteer participation surged, with many former defendants choosing to continue their service even after fulfilling their court-mandated hours. The city's Social Services Department reported improved access to vulnerable populations, attributing the change to better coordination with the justice system. One particularly moving case involved Maria Sanchez, a retired nurse who had accumulated parking tickets while delivering meals to homebound seniors. Under the new system, she not only avoided fines, but also received support to expand her service. Her network of volunteer nurses now provided basic health screenings alongside meal deliveries, reaching seniors who had previously fallen through the cracks of the healthcare system. Harvard Law School sent researchers to study the program's impact. Their preliminary findings suggested that the Harrison-Thompson model could serve as a template for courts nationwide. "What we're seeing here," noted Professor Jonathan Wright, "is a fundamental shift in how the justice system can serve as a catalyst for positive community change." On a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after their initial courtroom encounter, Judge Harrison and Sarah Thompson stood before the State Bar Association. Their joint presentation, Bridging Justice and Community Service, received a standing ovation. But the real victory was in the daily transformation of lives, occurring quietly in courtroom 304 and throughout the city's streets. 1 year after their initial encounter, the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom once again hosted a gathering of Boston's most influential citizens. This time, however, Judge William Harrison sat in the audience while Sarah Thompson stood at the podium, preparing to accept the prestigious Liberty Bell Award for transformative community service. The Crystal Award caught the light as the State Bar Association president presented it, but it was Sarah's words that captured the audience's attention. "Through justice," she began, her voice carrying the same dignity that had first impressed Harrison a year ago, "isn't just about maintaining order. It's about understanding the complex tapestry of human experience that brings people before the court." Harrison observed the faces around him, fellow judges, attorneys, community leaders, all nodding in recognition of a truth that had taken him 62 years to understand. His own daughter, Catherine, who had flown in from Manhattan for the ceremony, sat beside him, her hand resting proudly on his arm. Sarah continued her address, weaving together statistics and stories that illustrated their program's impact. "In the past year, we've seen more than just reduced recidivism rates. We've witnessed the emergence of a new paradigm where the justice system and community service work in harmony rather than opposition. The presentation screen behind her displayed images that told their story. The new mobile library vans with their designated parking permits, the expanded domestic violence shelter network, the youth mentorship program that had grown from their initial collaboration. Each image represented countless lives touched by their reformed approach to justice. When Sarah acknowledged him from the podium, Harrison felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Judge Harrison's willingness to question his own assumptions, she said, created ripples that have transformed our entire community. He showed us that it's never too late to choose understanding over judgment, collaboration over punishment. The evening proceeded with various presentations highlighting the program's success stories. Maria Sanchez's senior care network had expanded to 3 neighboring cities. James Carter's youth literacy program had achieved a 40% improvement in reading scores among participating students. Margaret Chen's Meals on Wheels program now operated with unprecedented efficiency thanks to the new parking permit system. During the reception that followed, Harrison found himself approached by a young law student who had been following their program's development. "Sir," she asked, "what advice would you give to future judges about maintaining both order and compassion?" Harrison considered the question carefully, his gaze drifting to where Sarah stood surrounded by community leaders and volunteers. "Listen," he finally replied. "Listen to the stories beneath the violations. Justice without understanding isn't justice at all." As the evening drew to a close, Harrison and Sarah found themselves once again near the coat check, mirroring their conversation from a year ago. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, adjusting her Liberty Bell award in its presentation box, "that a parking ticket could lead to all this?" Harrison smiled, remembering his rigid certainty of that morning in court. "It wasn't the ticket," he responded. "It was your dignity in the face of injustice that made me question everything I thought I knew about the law." Together, they walked out into the Boston evening, their path illuminated by both streetlights and the knowledge that their work had only begun. The city around them hummed with the energy of a community transformed, where justice and compassion now worked hand in hand, and where every courtroom held the potential for positive change.